Mexico, very strong on shale gas. The Mexican opportunities, I think, are actually kind of interesting under the energy reform that is now taking place in Mexico. The opportunities for development of resources in Mexico are rising, and the possibility of shale gas development in Mexico really should not be counted out. On the oil side, on the right-hand side, you see Russia, the US, China, Argentina, and so on. One of the things that I just want to mention in passing is that US number could be a little bit lower now that we've had another look at the Monterey shales. Not going to make much of a difference to production. It was one of the things when some of the commentary in the press came out about EIA's downgrade of the technically recoverable resource base in the Monterey shales in California, is that, oh, this was going to be a real problem for shale development. Not really. Our longer-term forecast for shale oil production in the Monterey shales is actually higher this year, even after the downgrade in the resource base, than the estimates that we were making last year. It's just that the production numbers coming from California are very small. We were assuming something like 20,000 barrels a day of production, and now we're up to, possibly twice that number, looking out over the long term. But the real growth in petroleum from shale in the U.S. is coming from places like Eagle Ford, Bakken, and the Permian. So what we did, and this kind of goes to the comments I think that Paul Joskow was making about peak oil. What we did in reviewing the resource base in the Monterey shales, I think has very little to do with production outlook. I'm going to end on this slide. Just some thoughts about the geopolitical implications of shale resources. One of the implications in the U.S. is with this oil being both light and sweet, the growth in crude oil production in the U.S. is very much straining refinery configurations, refinery output slates, transportation logistics, a lot of oil now moving around by rail, for example, almost 1 million barrels a day. And leading to questions not just about exports and export policy, but even the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was designed under the set of assumptions that the U.S. could lose imports of crude oil and would need to replace those in a world where the U.S. could be a net exporter of oil. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve operations, I think, policymakers will probably want to look at that, to think about what's the best use. High volumes of shale oil production and could, for example, diminish OPEC's market share and potentially pricing power over time, although in the medium term, so in the short run, I think that the production in shale in the U.S. is actually helping calm the oil markets. Longer term, EIA's forecast, as once you get out past about 2025, we see OPEC's market share actually growing and a continuing need for investment in the OPEC countries to satisfy world demand. One of the things that I like to highlight when talking about geopolitical implications of shale growth in the U.S., people talk about U.S. energy independence. Well, why do they say that? Well, we're already a net exporter of coal. We're a net exporter. We will be a net exporter of natural gas in another 2 years. We are a net exporter of petroleum products. It's possible that we could become a total net petroleum exporter. And in electricity, we're essentially self-sufficient, energy independence. But as we learned just over the past 3 weeks, when developments happen in the world, and the most recent one is the struggles that we're seeing in Iraq, impact the global oil markets. Oil prices in the U.S. go up, whether we are importing all of our oil or even a little bit of it. It's a global market, and consumers are impacted everywhere, and the economy is impacted everywhere. Russia's share of the European gas market could be reduced if we were to see European shale production or even exports of U.S. gas into the European markets. China's success in shale development could alter its need for LNG imports and other fuel imports, an interesting thing to think about over the long term. And then finally, shorter lead times in shale oil and gas development might actually kind of change the model that people think about in terms of production and price volatility. If shale oil production, let's focus on that in just a second, can be turned on and turned off in the same way that we saw gas rigs leaving the Marcellus in 2012 when natural gas prices fell and those rigs went into oil plays like the Eagle Ford and others. It is certainly possible, and I think maybe even probable would be the view, that development of shale resources in the U.S. could lead to lower price volatility because of the ability to both bring on oil production or take it off the market. I was actually at a meeting with Minister Naimi in Saudi Arabia earlier this year where he was thinking about the possibility that Saudi spare production could tend to limit price increases in the global markets and the ability or necessity to quickly respond to price declines in the U.S. With lower drilling rates in shales could reduce the volatility to the downside in shale. It's a new game technologically and economically in these shale resources, and I think the geopolitics could change as well. So thank you very much. And now let's, I think what we'd like to do here, Mike, with your permission, is we'll let David and Eric respond to my comments, and then we'll be happy to try to answer questions after that.
Thanks, Adam. Adam looks like a sweet old man. I just want to disabuse you of that notion. Over dinner last night, we had a conversation about, what were we going to wear, and he said, "Oh, it's business casual. Won't be any ties to be seen tomorrow morning."
I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you, and I have to wear a tie.
The thing that really upsets me is I've been suckered by him often enough before. I can't believe I felt like it. Anyhow, delighted to have an opportunity to offer a few thoughts. Adam has, as anticipated, given a very comprehensive view, not only of what the Renaissance is in North America, but what it means internationally. So I think I'm pretty much done. But how you view it really depends on who you are and where you are. And I'm going to offer just a few lenses on that. Because producers may view it as a threat, or as Adam says, they may view it as a flaw. I'm not a lawyer, I haven't reviewed the constitutions of every country in the world, but I still haven't found any that make it an offence for oil to be priced at less than the full cycle cost of development. So I'm not completely convinced that it will be a flaw, but at the same time, there's no question the changing anatomy of what's perceived to be the marginal producer has meant that the lead times have gone from 6 years to 6 months. And on the gas side, a perception that whatever happens in North America, their gas prices are going to be whatever the full cycle cost of LNG export difference will be to the rest of the world. So even if gas prices aren't going to be $2, $3, $4, or even $5 an MMBTU, the odds are that they're going to be less than those people who are having to import LNG. And that, I think, has implications through another lens. Consumers don't seem to know whether it's a threat or a boon. On the one hand, it's alternatives to Russia, although there are 1 or 2 on Capitol Hill who would benefit from knowing that LNG exports aren't going to happen next week in response to this morning's cut-off of Russian gas to Ukraine. The lead times in that regard are probably still long. Others think that it's good, it will drive down gas prices globally. Sometimes we foresee what we wish for. And some see it as a threat because they see it as creating a competitive advantage for US manufacturers. And as Adam said, particularly refiners and chemical producers are worried that when faced with a major competitor who's got energy at a third of the cost and feedstocks depending on the size of the ethylene or ethane glut, potentially has a locked-in advantage. Then there's another lens, which is wannabe shale producers who see the model of what was done in North America as an opportunity for them, whether that's China, Argentina, but all I can say is probably not Europe. But I'll let Eric argue as to why that might be. So, having said there are 3 dimensions, I'm now going to drill in a little further on 4 dimensions, because I wrote this without counting before. That's okay, I'm an engineer, not an economist, so I'm limited to 5. I can't go on beyond that. Security of supply, clearly anything that adds to the diversity of supply sources from politically stable sources is positive news. I apologize to any Canadians in the audience for suggesting that the United States is politically stable, or indeed even their friend. But with what's going on in Libya, Iraq, and now Ukraine and elsewhere, I think that stability and political reliability are relative terms. And so if we lower the bar, then the US will look good. There's a perception of security of demand, and I wonder if what we're seeing is potentially a change of paradigm. And by that what I mean is that, go back 15 years, the logistical cost of shipping products long distance rather than crude oil was often 10 to 15% of the value of a barrel. The balkanization of product specifications meant that a refined product that was consumable in the United States was probably not, consumable in China or in India or in the Middle East or in parts of Europe was probably not consumable in, certainly not California, and probably other parts of the United States as well. There's been a change in the structure of the market where there's an awful lot more trade in unfinished products and in blend stocks. That might lead to a situation which I'll come on to in terms of industrial competitiveness, where we might see the increase in supply and America coming out of the market to an extent, and security of demand. Just ask the Nigerians what security of demand looks like. You can loyally supply light sweet crude to the United States for a very long time, and then the second they have a bit of their own, you've got to go and find new markets for it. Maybe what we'll see is that security of demand will show up as refining coming closer to production and products in unfinished or blend stock form being traded more. And that feeds into this industrial competitiveness and the theme that seems to underpin everything that comes from the oil and gas renaissance, which is jobs. We are, I think, still, despite the promises from all those who said they knew better, we're in the 7th year of the lost decade. We're not seeing anything that particularly encourages us to think we won't get to the 10th year of the lost decade. That jobs, and as a result, mercantilism are on the wax, so to speak. That when, I guess, in the wake of the economic crisis, all the G20 leaders said that there would be no protectionism and no mercantilism. If you look at the photographs, you'll see that they all had their hands behind their backs and that their fingers were crossed as they said it. And it shows up in a variety of different ways, but I think that the oil and gas boom in North America and potentially elsewhere is leading to a new belief that even if it doesn't seem to be the most economically efficient thing to do, it's certainly the most politically efficient thing to do, to use your resources to bring jobs back, because jobs are the new currency of politics. And so you see that in terms of refining and petrochemicals, in North America and the Gulf. Probably bad news for Asian naphtha-based and other geographically disadvantaged producers. Probably that means that we will see quite a lot of coal going into chemicals in at least some parts of the world. But I would argue that it actually doesn't really matter in a global competitive economy if stuff ends up being made cheaper somewhere else. You know, if Germans end up importing plastic bags made by BASF in the United States, they still get cheaper plastic bags. They simply have to think of something else to do to earn a living rather than making expensive plastic bags. That's sort of how the global economy works. So it's probably greater supply and prices lower than otherwise they would have been. It's probably good news overall. But with that caution about this key difference that it looks good for America, and if others succeed in having low-cost feedstocks, they're able to bring jobs, even if they're not, it doesn't make the most economic sense. For a period of time, it's going to be pretty cold in Europe from an employment perspective. The fourth lens, though, is the role model for their own production. And you've probably heard people go on at some length about why North America is exceptional or why it's not exceptional, and how widely the boom is going to travel around the globe. It's anyone's guess, because there are factors outside anyone's control related to the geology, as well as factors within their control, which political classes have a track record of overestimating the ease with which things can be done. But again, a lot of people view development as bringing greater employment, and jobs seems to be, or employment seems to be the lens that a lot of people look at the boom through in the region, either as a threat or as an opportunity, whether we're talking in the Middle East or in Asia more generally. So I would only suggest that there are more questions than answers, which I suppose is the easy and cowardly way out. The world is conflicted. People can, depending on how optimistic they feel getting out of bed in the morning, they can feel that the oil and gas renaissance in the United States is an opportunity. They can feel that it's a threat. Should they be relieved or worried, who knows? But I would leave you with one thought. It's got a very positive impact on the balance of payments and the solvency of the United States. And is the world a better or worse place with a solvent United States? Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here and to talk for such a distinguished audience together with these distinguished speakers. I'm going to provide you with a couple of thoughts about this with my distinctly European glasses on. While doing so, I'll do the same thing as David did, cheat. So I start out with a picture from China, since he spoke about Europe. I represent Statoil, which is Scandinavia's largest company. We have activities in 35 to 40 countries, including in the US and Canada, and we're part of the shale revolution, both in the old Norwegian state of North Dakota, but also in Pennsylvania. And thanks for a great presentation, Adam. It's always a pleasure to both read what you write and listen to what you say. And my questions are, what does the shale revolution do for Europe? We know it's probably definitely good, I'll come back to that, but it's definitely good for the US. The question is, should we worry, the Europeans, or should we be happy? And I think it will be clear when I'm through what I mean about that. These are some slides showing our forecast for global oil, global crude production, but also including NGLs. The shale revolution is significant. It has huge impact in different regions of the US. It has a large impact on the US economy and energy balance, and it has a significant impact on global markets, partly depending on what the US does to its export policies. And for oil, it contributes to the increase in non-OPEC production towards 2025, as we see here in the left chart. You see that there's a bulk coming up there in non-OPEC. And it reduced the call on OPEC or the dependence on OPEC until around 2025. I agree with that. It's around there where OPEC's market share starts taking off again. And it also, which is not that clear in this chart, but one of the impacts of the shale revolution is that it also potentially keeps production from conventional sources of crude oil higher because of the technology transfer that is taking place. So that the decline rate of existing conventional fields in the US and elsewhere will be slower. However, we still depend, and that is where I put this into the perspective, we still depend on the Middle East, North Africa, we depend on Russia, both in the gas market and in the oil market. We depend on Brazil, we depend on Angola, and at some point we're going to depend on Kazakhstan as well. We thought we would be dependent on Kazakhstan already, but it's taken 15 years to develop the Kazakhstan field, and it will probably take more. The uncertainty about the future production of Iraq is huge. Demonstrated last weeks, but it's there, it has been there for a while, and the range of possible outcomes of the delta, the difference between current Iraqi production and what they will produce in 2025 is larger than the shale oil production in the US. So there are other regions in the world where the uncertainty about future production is larger, and it's important to put this into perspective when you look at the global impact of this. And of course it depends on demand development. And what makes the shale revolution in particular in terms of crude special in the US is that it comes at a time when US crude demand is flat or starts to decline. And that's why you get these interesting impacts on potential future net exports out of a region which has traditionally been a net importer. We are all, this is where I cheat, I'll start talking a little bit about Asia as well. The global economic point of gravity moves back to where it was before the Industrial Revolution, back to where people live. More than half the world population lives within 4,000 kilometers or 2,500 miles of Hong Kong. And they're becoming part of the global middle class. This is where demand is. This is where demand will be, and this is where demand is growing. In 2040, China alone will consume as much, almost as much energy as all of OECD. And Asia is a region, together with Europe, which is short of oil and gas. And the word for the climate is that they're not that short of coal. So there will be competition for us Europeans, there will be competition for whatever oil and gas comes out of the US or the Middle East or elsewhere. And we're talking about the import deficits in Asia. And note the import deficits of Europe, both for crude and gas, and these are increasing. European import deficit of crude oil in 2030 is about the same as the Chinese import deficit of crude oil in 2030. We're in the opposite situation in North America. Our import dependence is increasing. And Norway is part of Europe here, just to mention that. We're sort of indigenous Europe. In Europe, that's not often, in Brussels, we're often presented as being outside. The outlook for shale in Europe is much less prolific than here in the US for many reasons. Probably the quality of resources are different. We don't know that yet, but the ones that have tried say that it is. The location is definitely a problem. The biggest unconventional source of shale oil in Europe is underneath Paris. So there are population density areas, issues. The US is a sparsely populated region, Europe is not. It has to do with attitudes, it has to do with regulation, property rights, taxes, etc., etc. So the outlook for shale in Europe is much less optimistic than here. So we need to import. We should be very happy that we have Russia, consistent, secure supplier of gas and oil to Europe for decades. There's a bit of a worry what's happening at the moment. They currently shut off the deliveries to Ukraine, but not to the deliveries that are supposed to go through Ukraine, and then it depends what the Ukrainians are doing about that. But they've been proven to be a significant deliverer of gas and oil to Europe, and let's hope they will continue to do that because we need them. We also need to import from Central Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, and from North America. We need our exports, guys. And then, as I said, we have to compete with East Asia for these imports. It is in everybody's interest, also the US, that exports are allowed to facilitate effective markets, value creation, and income maximization on both sides of both oceans. A little bit about trade balances. The shale revolution contributes to value creation here. It contributes to new jobs, as David alluded to. Some new manufacturing, some improved trade terms, and some improved trade balances. And the size and impact of this reindustrialization as a consequence of cheap and available energy is still uncertain. There are many in Europe's energy-intensive industries that has voiced worry about the combination of local high energy prices in Europe and then its increased potential competition from the US. But again, we should put this into perspective. Manufacturing is much larger as a share of overall population and value creation in Europe than here. In particular, advanced manufacturing is much larger. There are only a few sectors that are very dependent on energy prices in terms of their overall cost levels. And the German car producers and chemical companies already have had operations here in the US for long. My car, which is a German car, was produced in Georgia. So why worry, in a sense? I think that the voiced concern from the the European manufacturing industries are a bit exaggerated. Some increase in manufacturing in the US, some increase in the US competitiveness, and some improvement of the US trade deficit will not hurt, not anybody. Last time I bought my Alpine skis, I bought them here, or to be precise, in Washington, D.C. They were produced in Germany, but I brought them back and it cost me 2/3 of what it would cost in Germany. So let's buy our European manufacturing products where the competition in the trading retail level is high, which is here. A little bit about the geopolitical implications of what's happening. And I agree with very much of what Adam said. It has large implications for the US, and since it has implications for the US, it has implications for geopolitics. We see this new source of spare capacity potentially in the oil market, which has an impact on OPEC, both as a challenge, but also to allow OPEC to increase their exports to Asia. So the vessels coming out of the Hormuz Straits are not turning left instead of right. And one of the reasons they do that is because the US is becoming more self-sufficient in oil. In terms of the spare capacity thing and the impact on price volatility, I think it's true that the potential help from shale oil on reduced price volatility in the short to medium term is more important when prices fall than when prices are increased. So we have to rely on Saudi Arabia to produce more when prices go up, and then we have to rely on the US to cut back when prices fall. Exports of US gas, which we expect in line with the EIA, but to a limited degree, to Europe and Asia will impact markets. It will not mean equal prices, but it will mean that the Henry Hub price will serve as an indicator of what the prices can be both in Asia and Europe. Will also balance part of Russia's importance in Europe and in Asia. It also allows gas to grow its market share relative to other fuels, in particular coal, and that's good. So if the US starts to export gas, we might import less coal from the US and other regions in Europe, and that makes sense, especially in a region that is focusing on climate policies. China's use on gas is supply constrained, so there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between their indigenous shale growth and their LNG imports. Both can grow because demand is growing so much. They need all the gas we can give them or sell to them. There's room for both domestic shale production in China, imports of pipe gas from Russia and Central Asia and Myanmar, and imports from the US or Canada. And we, as global citizens and as Europeans also, we need the Chinese to get all the gas and use all the gas they can to reduce their coal dependence. That's the most critical issue in terms of long-term sustainability of global energy markets. So, overall, the shale revolution is good news for all of us, Europeans and Americans alike. And thank you for listening.
Okay, well, we got the microphones there working. So, we're ready for questions. If you would come to the microphone there, if you would state your name and your organization and a very brief statement of your question, please. Not a speech, but a question. Do we have questions from the audience?
Good morning. I'm İlhan Or from Bosphorus University, Turkey. I would like first to thank all speakers for a very illuminating overview of this shale renaissance in North America and its impacts all over the world. What I would like to ask about is the impacts on renewable energy, including biofuel and nuclear, of this renaissance. What will be the impacts on subsidies in different parts of the world, the perspectives of renewable energy and nuclear. If the presenters could comment on that, I would be delighted. Thank you very much.
Let me try first. In the United States, EIA has looked at a number of side cases to the reference case in our annual energy outlook. In terms of what the shale oil and shale gas mean on the oil side, I think we just heard everybody up here actually talk about the impact on the U.S. economy, jobs, the trade deficit. That is coming through reduced levels of oil imports. And literally, as I said, 2 years, it'll be natural gas exports. I think that thinking about the impact on renewables, natural gas is playing a very important role in providing the base load backup power that intermittent renewables like wind and solar require in order to balance out loads in the absence of improvements in battery technology or some other way to store electricity. I think that the growth in shale oil production has and the difficulties associated with moving forward on the technology for non-corn based ethanol is having an impact on renewable fuels, liquid fuels. I think that thinking about where we're going forward in terms of renewables in the U.S., there is still going to be a need for all forms of energy in the U.S., I think particularly in electric power. If we begin to impose further constraints on carbon content of fuels, then non-carbon-based renewables will have to play an increasing role along with nuclear power. The U.S. has remained a strong supporter of nuclear. even in the aftermath of the tragedy at Fukushima. And I believe that the opportunities for all fuels looking out in the future, including coal, with carbon capture and sequestration and better pollution controls for things like mercury and other air toxics, will be there. Certainly, I think David mentioned the need, I think it was Wood that talked about the use of coal that's likely to be taking place in places like China and India. Will have a huge impact on global energy, the global energy outlook, simply because of the number of people in those countries that want electricity as they move into the middle class, and coal provides a path towards that. So I think that there's lots of things. I'll stop there. I don't know if anybody else wants to have a comment. If there are any other questions, you might want to form a queue with that microphone.
Yeah, I do want to suggest a far messier world than Adam has described. Because if you think about all the transitions that have happened in the past, all of the fuels that have apparently been transitioned away from actually have higher production and consumption today than ever they did before those transitions. Whereas what you're talking about implicitly is a reduction in absolute demand rather than just a diminution in the rate of growth. Two things are going to happen. One is we're going to come down the supply curves because we're going to have less demand. And second, the supply curves themselves are going to come down because the incumbent or the companies engaged in the incumbent technologies and fuels aren't going to sit there and say, oh, Statoil's not about to say, I guess we're out of the oil business, we're out of the gas business, any more than coal producers in the United States have said we're out of the coal business, they push it off elsewhere. So I think we're going to see the most extraordinary competitive response to this. That means 2005, wind and natural gas-fired power were just about competitive in the United States, even when you allowed for the costs of backup. Today, the gap between them is back to where it was back in about 1998 sort of time frame. You will see repeated cycles of competitive response between companies involved in the incumbent fuels and technologies and the new fuels and technologies. And so the one message I'll offer about incentives and support for renewables is it's going to go on for a lot longer. Instead of 5 to 7 years, as I was told by a UK energy minister a couple of weeks ago, it's going to be 5 to 7 decades, and that it is going to drive costs down in the incumbent fuels and technologies, so the transition is going to take an awful lot longer than is anticipated. And I just wonder whether or not, given that jobs and employment and social stability are so important, whether we will see people having the patience to continue that degree of support for as long as would be implied by what I just said.
I'll just add the comment that there's room for all, there's room for both. Both in a low carbon world and in a reference case that you can pick and choose from, whether it's EIA or IEA or ours for that matter. We need more energy in 2040 than we are producing and using today. We need more gas. We need more oil that can be delivered from existing fields because of decline rates. And we need a lot more renewables. Not all energy is electricity. And one of the challenges with the renewable part of this is that how can we deliver heating, manufacturing, and transportation, which is not electricity. So we need it all. And the size of the challenge is such that we cannot depend on renewables to deliver this to 2040 or 50 for that matter. In our reference case, we assume 15 to 20,000 windmills, offshore, large offshore windmills, every year for 15 years. Just to make up for the part of the energy mix that then is renewables. And we still need a lot more oil and gas. And if we don't deliver oil and gas, we'll have much more coal.
Thank you, Eric. So, the next question. So, keep the questions short, and I'll ask our panel
Because there's a lot of folks that really has to be questions. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Prakash Lamani from the International Monetary Fund, Washington. This isn't a comment, this isn't a question, just a comment. I wanted to thank all panelists for taking such a global perspectives, and just wanted to mention two IMF studies that reach similar conclusions. One finds that for the US manufacturing that the lower energy costs did play a role, but so did other factors like the depreciation of the dollar as well as lower unit labor costs. So I agree very much with the panelists that it gives some advantage to the US manufacturing, but not as much as some have claimed. And the second, based on our global economy model, we find that increases in the projected increases in US energy production using EIA's base case has a small positive impact on the US, but it's very modest. And the other thing is that it has an impact, a positive impact even on other regions. So even if there wasn't increased energy production in Europe for the reasons that Eric was describing, you would find, just for general equilibrium effects, that even a US energy boom is good for most countries in the world. The impact on the energy producers in the Middle East is negative but modest. So I think that we should keep these factors in mind, that general equilibrium effects generally mean that a good thing in the US is going to have good impacts elsewhere as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Carsten Neuer, DLW Berlin. To all speakers, the EPA has just announced to take the lead on the climate policy on the US side. What do you think is going to be the impact on the carbon intensity of electricity production and use standards that will be implemented on the gas demand? Is going to stabilize gas demand in the US in a way that even at higher gas prices, gas that we use, is going to impact the shift between fuels? What's your anticipation there?
EIA is going to be looking at that, so I'll do something very unusual. I'll wait till we do the study before I comment.
I would only say that it looks like the carbon intensity of the electricity supply systems where American coal gets exported to are going to probably go up, probably by at least as much as it may go down in the US. I think it's a more complicated question, and indeed I'll probably read out in the study as well.
Gunnar Eskelin, Norwegian School of Economics. I wish you all welcome to Bergen 2 years from now. The weather forecast is beautiful. I'm a little bit surprised by to all three of you, your lack of interest in how the economies respond. And here's my specific illustration. I'm interested in environment and climate. I think the transportation sector is going to change quite rapidly, using more electricity and more natural gas. And none of you have mentioned the potential of more gas use in the United States. I think it's going to be bus fleets, trucking fleets, and then personal vehicles. And I think it's going to happen first, natural gas and electricity.
Can I just go? Yeah. So all the buses in America use 100,000 barrels a day of oil. So I can't get excited about buses. The trucking fleet, again, we saw some numbers. If you look at the pace in which, Adam showed the IEA projections, I would say even if you're twice as aggressive as that, it's still not going to be a huge amount. So there is going to be greater gas usage, but look at electric cars. How much did you pay for your BMW?
It cost $200,000 in all.
Yeah. And what does a Tesla cost?
$100,000.
Exactly. And how many Teslas are there in Norway? I mean, why doesn't every Norwegian have a Tesla?
Because they can't deliver enough.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's, why is that bad for buses? Because Norwegians in Teslas are allowed to drive at bus lanes, which means the people who are taking mass transportation find that it's no longer as convenient because all the whatever's driving their Teslas, I'm sure there's a word for Tesla drivers in Norwegian, are clogging up the bus lanes. So it's not that we've got a complete lack of interest. I think we've got a skepticism that something that sounds like a new good thing, especially when it's found by Elon Musk, isn't going to happen as fast and as extensively as he says.
But just to be fair, in our forecast, baseline forecast, we have a substantial increase in gas demand in North America. Part of the reason being the availability of cheap gas. And part of that is going to be into transportation, mostly LNG and trucking. You don't see the same. You will not see the same kind of development in Europe for many reasons. Part of it is that the long-haul trucking industry in Europe is much smaller than in the US. The transportation logistics is completely different. There are so many countries and they are so small. We are more optimistic or aggressive, if you like, in terms of overall use of electricity in transportation than IEA. And at some point around 2030, global oil demand peaks, partly because of the peak of use of gasoline and diesel in global transportation. That means that there will be electricity in cars, but it will be, how quickly that takes over depends on how quickly the Chinese stop to buy new cars.
Just the fuel light on your conventional car comes on to say that you're running out of fuel about the same capacity in miles left as the range of most electric cars. Okay, so range anxiety is a real issue and it's a real thing. Why is it that less than 4%, I think maybe including diesel, America has got to 5% of vehicles are alternative fuel this year, despite 10 years worth of incentives and whatever else. It takes longer than you expect. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen in the long run. It doesn't mean you're not going to build up momentum, but it just is difficult to get excited about it in the next 10 and 20 years. If only 5% of new car sales, and that's about 12% of the total fleet gets turned over each year, so even I can work out